Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra nuggets and tidbits to get your teeth into to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. We're going to go to three separate subjects today. We'll start with Jabal Viktor Orban, the autocrat in charge of Hungary. Yes, he was democratically elected, but since being elected democratically, he has been manipulating the instruments of power in Hungary so that he is unlikely to be unelected going forward and or not elected again. And he's changing the landscape, the political and civic landscape in Hungary such that they are democratically backsliding. And that is why I often call him a kind of pseudo-dictator, certainly an autocrat. He says he wants an illiberal democracy. So he wants to water down his democracy until it's illiberal, and I guess the electorate is easily manipulated because the judges are on his side and the media is on his side. So anyway, we're going to go to Pekka Kaluniemi, who does his Vacnik Soup, and this version of Vacnik Soup concentrates on Viktor Orban. He says, I'll introduce a Hungarian lawyer and politician, Viktor Orban. He's best known for turning Hungary into an authoritarian state and for cooperating with other authoritarian regimes like the Kremlin, the CCP, and Iran. He continues, Orban has been Hungary's prime minister since 2010, and under his leadership, 14 years as a prime minister, you've got to start wondering if things are really free, fair, democratic, fresh. Under his leadership, the country has basically become the first non-democracy in the EU. Orban himself has described Hungary as, quote, an illiberal state, and has used the Kremlin's playbook to indeed create it. He created a nationwide right-wing media network, and interfering with independent media has plummeted Hungary's press freedom index into 67th place, one of the worst in the EU. The state has also spied on Hungarian journalists by using the infamous Pegasus spyware. After taking over the media, Orban started working on the court system, firing anyone he saw as a threat. Later, he reshaped the voting system to favour his party Fidesz, a process that's often referred to as gerrymandering, giving Fidesz supermajority in Parliament. Some have suggested that, and by the way, if you're listening to this, every tweet I'm talking through of Pekka's here, there are sourced articles to support that, and I'm showing the front page of these articles and the titles. So, for example, this one is Premier Orban and Interior Minister Pinter accused of taking mob payouts in the 1990s. Anyway, some have suggested that Orban's closeness to Russia and Putin stems from his early days as a politician when he allegedly received cash from Russian mafia boss Semyon Mogilevich. The incident was allegedly recorded and then passed over to Russian secret services. By the way, if you want to see a really detailed article, really good article, I remember using this in my research for an article I wrote on Tucker Carlson, Viktor Orban, Hungary, and whatnot, and the Heritage Foundation, following the money. This article is really very good. New Republic: How Viktor Orban Built His Illiberal State, and in fact, it's a 2022 article, but it goes back into the background of how Orban came to be where he is now. Really worth reading. Anyway, moving on. So, I'll continue here. The Orban's fans in the West see him as a Christian conservative who's standing up to woke European bureaucrats. But when taking a closer look at his policies in the last 14 years, we quickly see that his government's most consistent policy direction has been embracing China. And there's no coincidence that Xi Jinping is visiting after France today. He's on the way to Hungary and Serbia. And here we have a couple of articles. ABC News: Hungary's Orban urges European conservatives and Trump towards election victories at CPAC event. So that's the American Republican Conservative Conference. And here, Washington Post opinion piece: Hungary's leader should be radioactive to the right. Why does CPAC love him? And there is certainly a lot to be said about his kind of traditional values, Christian conservatism that he is trying to espouse. Indeed, Pekka Kalaniemi then next says his alleged Christian conservatism has also made him a rock star of US conservative politics, and he was recently interviewed by the infamous pro-Kremlin conspiracy theorist Tucker Carlson. Orban also hosts the annual Conservative Political Action Committee CPAC conference. So Victor, this AP Associated Press piece, Viktor Orban's anti-woke resistance has made him the splinter under the fingernail of the EU. And then a Politico article, Viktor Orban tells Tucker Carlson, Trump's the man to save the West. Another article, CNN, American conservatives embrace Hungary's authoritarian leader at Budapest conference. Okay, we continue. This year's CPAC featured many prominent conservative speakers, including Orban himself, Prime Minister of Georgia, PVV leader Geert Wilders, Jack Posobiec, and Trump lackey Vivek Ramaswamy, who has incidentally named China as the biggest adversary of the US. So that's quite interesting. This is like a who's who of people not to hang out with. You know, the present Georgia Dream leader in Georgia, hanging out with Viktor Orban. Then we've got Geert Wilders from Holland, from the Netherlands. And then, you know, a number of these other ones. The president of Vlaams Belang is a right-wing party in Belgium, so on and so forth. And then we go on to the next page and we've got, you know, more of the same. Vivek Ramaswamy, yes, and a number of these other ones. Eva Vladingerbroek is someone who, from the Netherlands, is someone who's gaining a bit of prominence, probably because she's very photogenic, a pretty blonde lady. I'm not trying to demean her for that, but you quite often get this in that there is a very much a PR aspect to certain people who are then, you know, we've seen this a lot with conservative Americans, Tommy Lauren and all sorts of people like that who gain a lot of traction based on bringing that kind of appeal. But then, so therefore you think, oh, this person can't surely say, I think this is how the psychology works, and don't shoot me for being kind of sexist or anything here, but I think the idea is that this person can't say anything like too egregious because look how pretty they are, and actually they say some really tremendously dodgy things. Right. This year's CPAC, as mentioned, featured many of those political ne'er-do-wells, I would say. Usually authoritarian states tend to become allies and do business together. Since 2009, Orban has been very close with the Kremlin and Putin, but what people often forget is that he's been doing close cooperation with the Chinese leadership, at least since 2010. Already back in 2011, Orban was praising the CCP regime because, quote, it was not dominated by that Western liberal idea that filling with the books is the way to get the best economic indicators. It's so rich that he claims that the West is good at fiddling the books when China and Russia fiddle their own economic books to present facts or supposed facts that they want you to read. And Hungary is seen as is the most corrupt nation in the EU presently. So it's just absolute projection there. After this, Chinese investments started pouring into Hungary. By 2022, flattery gets you everywhere, right? By 2022, China had become the largest investor in Hungary. For example, and here we have a load of news articles talking about Chinese investments into Hungary. Chinese investment contributes to Hungary's growth. Viktor Orban courts closer cooperation with Huawei during a visit to China. A railway line between Serbia and Hungary opens for passenger trains after 8 years of closure on the basis of Chinese help. A Hungarian town seized over a giant Chinese battery plant. Anyway, there you go. So, for example, Huawei's largest logistics center in Europe is located in Hungary, and China is financing the Hungary-Serbia railway, the Kaposvár solar power station, and the Debrecen battery factory. Interestingly, the Trump administration banned Huawei and many of its subsidiaries from the US due to trade war, espionage, and other national security threats. Canadian authorities even arrested Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, at the request of the US in 2018. And a couple of articles here. First one from The Verge. Donald Trump extends Huawei ban through to May 2021. And the US got Canada to arrest the top Chinese executive. Okay. While meeting Trump in the US in March 2024, Orban also met with Heritage Foundation leadership and Vivek Ramaswamy. Ironically, Heritage and Ramaswamy calls Orban's closest ally, China, the CCP, the most persistent and consequential threat facing the American people today. I wonder whether someone like Vivek Ramaswamy, as he starts hanging out with these people more obviously in these political arenas, whether he will suddenly adopt a very different position to China. Indeed, when we heard about the TikTok ban and Trump changed his mind on the TikTok ban because of a big funder to a big political funder to the Republicans, Ramaswamy just followed suit and changed his position equally. So, yeah, I imagine he would change to whatever is politically expedient for him to do so. For Hungary, the CCP is a great source, or China is a great source of funding without any string, like advocating human rights attached. So here, how Chinese investment props up Orban and erodes democracy from Visegrad. And there's a bit of the article there. But like with Russian energy imports, it also increases Hungary's dependency on China. This cooperation and money flow can also create a debt trap for Hungary. We've seen this previously with nations like it's the Belt and Road Initiative, nations like Sri Lanka, who defaulted on a payment regarding or concerning building of port infrastructure, and China was then able to take control of the port, own the Sri Lankan port because they defaulted. So they can sort out these big financial cooperative deals with other nations, but they hold quite a bit of leverage over those nations. If those nations struggle to pay, then China can step in and take very powerful control over some of these pieces of infrastructure and whatnot. Yes, so as they've done in many other countries, the CCP is also attempting to promote the Chinese culture within Hungary. Hungary hosts 5 CCP-funded language and cultural centres known as Confucius Institutes, and they've also attempted to build a Shanghai Fudan University campus in Budapest. This sparked large protests, and the Budapest mayor even announced that the streets around the university would be renamed to commemorate human rights abuses by the CCP. Ouch. The university was labelled the CCP influence operation. So here we have a couple of articles, Radio Free Europe, saying what's next for China's Fudan University campus in Hungary, and then Budapest named streets as at planned Chinese university after Uyghurs, so they are the Muslim population in China who have been oppressed, and Hong Kong. So pretty trollish there, like it in a good way. Chinese university, says AP, Chinese university plan causes security concerns in Hungary. And Orban has also invited the Chinese police to patrol in Hungary. Setting up Chinese police stations in the EU is of course alarming, not only because the CCP has a well-documented history of harassing and intimidating overseas Chinese citizens and diaspora members. That's a direct quote. This is Renew Europe saying Chinese police activity in Hungary, quote, a significant risk to EU security. And then some of that article there, you can pause the video and read it. And then another, this is a CNN piece saying, exclusive, China operating over 100 police stations across the world with the help of some host nations, report claims. It's quite incredible, these influence operations that we're often unaware of. And it appears that the CCP has already got leverage on Hungary. In 2016, Hungary blocked an EU statement on China's maritime claims in the South China Sea and vetoed an EU statement condemning CCP security law in Hong Kong. I mean, why would they do that if they weren't compromised, if there wasn't quid pro quo? Hungary is such a problematic member of the EU. It really, really is. This is a Reuters piece titled, Hungary blocks EU statement criticising China over Hong Kong, diplomats say. In February 2024, Pekka continues, Hungary again blocked the EU's sanctions package against Russia, but according to diplomatic sources, the package wasn't blocked because of Orban's friendship with Russia, but because the sanctions also targeted for Chinese companies. So this is a news piece saying Hungary is again blocking the latest round of Russia sanctions, according to FT. Quote, the Hungarians did not agree due to Chinese companies, said one of the officials. Hungary and its Prime Minister Viktor Orban have on multiple occasions slowed down or diluted EU measures aimed at punishing Russia or assisting Ukraine. But it's actually China who are the more important entities. China more important to Hungary than Russia, arguably. And VS Square here reporting, or V Square, I think, sorry. Cash-strapped Hungary expects economic support from Xi Jinping's visit. So Hungary is in financial problem, economic, not free fall, but it's not in a good economic situation at the moment. And this means it is far more vulnerable to China's influence operations and whatever China can offer it. So for Orban, Pekka continues, all this seems to be a straightforward transaction, a source of money and influence as China's leading partner in Europe. In the meantime, Chinese companies can build factories in the heart of Europe with little apparent oversight. And of course, that means that they have access to the EU in terms of free movement of people, capital, produce, etc., etc. So they can take advantage of that trade bloc by setting themselves up in Hungary. The deal has led to Hungary becoming the CCP's most valuable ally in Europe, with economic ties evolving into common security interests. As Hungary is also a NATO member, this has raised concerns on issues such as intelligence sharing. And here we've got an article interview. Hungary looks forward to further cooperation with China, official says. And another article, NATO expands its defence innovation network in Hungary. So this is compromising arguably both the EU and NATO, the very close relationship between Hungary and China, and of course obviously Hungary and Russia. It's just such a problem, Hungary. This is also the reason why the CCP leader Xi Jinping will be meeting Orban during his Euro trip. Due to dire economic conditions, Hungary is desperately seeking for economic support, which the CCP can, of course, offer. Xi's other official visits will be France and Serbia, as mentioned. AP article here, Hungary and Serbia's autocratic leaders to roll out the red carpet for China's Xi during his Europe tour. So to conclude, Orban is a typical politician whose words and actions hardly meet. He's good friends with the most anti-CCP organizations in the US, while at the same time he's doing massive deals with China, making himself rich and his country more dependent on this foreign power. And here's another article from the Heritage Foundation. We're in a new Cold War. It's time our politicians acted like it. So on the one hand, the Heritage Foundation is saying that, hey, China are our big number one enemy. On the other hand, they do take, I know some people have questioned how much, but they do take money from Hungary and therefore from Russia through Hungary, through the propaganda arm of Hungary, through the Bethany Foundation and another, I forget what the other organization is. In fact, I've got my article open here that I wrote some time back. The Danube Institute, that was it. So the Danube Institute, through the Bethany Foundation and the Hungarian state, get money from Russia's Orban, from Russia and Orban, and then funnel that through to the Heritage Foundation, at least to some degree. And yet here we have Hungary cozying up with China and the Heritage Foundation being very different on China. So there's going to be some tension here. And CPAC, generally not fans of China. China are seen as the bigger problem for the US in many conservative eyes than Russia. But of course, I wouldn't really separate these two nations. Although they don't necessarily get on with each other, it's a marriage of convenience. They are connected in a way. How we deal with Russia in Ukraine will definitely affect how we approach China going forward and how China sees the West. Whether it is at all worried about the West, what the West does, or if we are weak and appeasing, then it will embolden China to do things that are contrary to the West's strategic objectives. Anyway, Pekka Kaluniemi continues, this has led to an absurd situation in which Orban is considered a rock star in the US, even though his political decisions and EU voting is undermining the American interests in the geopolitical arena. But hey, at least he's anti-woke. And here we have a political article. Viktor Orban brings culture war to Brussels. And Hungary remains the most corrupt country in the European Union. And thousands protest against Hungary's Orban in the ruling party stronghold. I was reporting on that this morning with Peter Magyar. But I think there's a lot to be said about smuggling. I know I said this ages ago when I had a big sort of rant on wokeism, or anti-wokeism actually, where you'll find that it's a distraction. Either when people complain about culture wars things, they've either got nothing to say that's of substance anywhere else. So they don't have an economic policy. They don't have a solution to, I don't know, whether it be border issues or infrastructure, or healthcare reform or whatever. They don't have policy, so they shout about culture war things, get people scared that the whole of society is going to break and fall apart, and get voted in on those real emotive issues. Or if they're not completely substantively vacuous, then actually they do have substance, but it's so problematic they'd rather you look at something over here. So it's like, oh, we're cozying up with China and we'd actually like to do some pretty dodgy underhand dealings with China, but culture war, wokeism. And everyone goes, yeah, let's support Viktor Orban over, his comments on, we hate the wokerati and all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, Orban is doing all sorts of dodgy stuff with Russia and China that is counter to whatever those voters otherwise would have wanted. And so, Viktor Orban is a big problem. Hungary is becoming a greater and greater concern for European unity, European security, the West, NATO, security, economics. Hungary is handing power and economic opportunity and security to, or handing elements of our security to China and indeed Russia. Just, so problematic. Right, the next topic we're going to pop into is Chechnya. So, is Chechnya preparing for Kadyrov's demise? So, we've got Ramzan Kadyrov, the warlord, who has been ill, and what could come next. So, we're going to dip into this a little bit. Chechen warlord Ramzan Kadyrov is used to speculation about his imminent demise. Pundits have discussed the 47-year-old's failing health since September, when the Chechen leader disappeared from the public eye and rumours began to circulate he was seriously unwell. And I reported that at the time. In the months since his appearance has changed. His face has appeared swollen and his words sometimes slurred. Russia's news outlet Novaya Gazeta Europe has reported that Kadyrov was suffering from necrotizing pancreatitis. The warlord was reportedly diagnosed with this condition, which happens when a person's pancreas starts to die, in 2019. By 2022, Kadyrov was struggling with both kidney failure and fluid buildup in his lungs, Novaya Gazeta Europe wrote. It's also reported that Kremlin was looking for a successor. Chechen officials moved quickly to dispel the rumours. A behind-the-scenes clip of Kadyrov's war cabinet appeared on social media hours after Novaya Gazeta's Europe's reporting went live, apparently to show a vibrant leader rallying his generals. The play quickly backfired. The cabinet clip showed a barely moving Kadyrov slurring a rambling monotone. A second clip, this time showing Kadyrov at a gym, made international headlines but appeared to convince few of the Chechens' leaders' well-being. And I showed you, I think, that clip of him putting weights around, pushing up weights and whatnot, but it was, he's not in a good way. Most have no doubt that Ramzan Kadyrov is unwell, but this doesn't automatically mean that the warlord will die in the immediate future. Yet there are signs that power dynamics are changing within the Chechen Republic, in Chechnya. Whether to lay the ground for when Ramzan dies or allow him to take a less active role in daily governance. And the moves mainly concerned at the moment his 18-year-old son Akhmat and his 16-year-old son Adam. So Adam was the one that beat up that guy who was being held for supposedly burning the Quran, but I think it was just a way of showing Adam Kadyrov flexing and showing how awesome he was, etc., etc. And he was later awarded the Hero of Chechnya award by his father. Anyway, in February 2024, so this year, Akhmat, the older son, received his first ministerial posting as Chechnya's Minister for Youth and Sports. So that's pretty good for an 18-year-old. A job given to him after less than 2 years of leading the region's state-backed youth movement. Akhmat also met Russian President Vladimir Putin in a highly unusual one-to-one meeting when he was just 17. Russian media outlets reported that the teenager was married soon after, a move which could help the Kadyrov family shore up alliances. So a bit like medieval marriages of political utilization there. Adam, the 16-year-old, meanwhile was appointed to his father's bodyguard in November 2023 and named as a trustee at a training school for Chechen special forces at the end of April. The institution also happens to be named in honor of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Previously, the teenager was best known for being captured on camera beating an unarmed prisoner accused of burning the Quran, as I mentioned. And indeed, Ramzan Kadyrov's daughter is the vice minister for, she's the deputy prime minister or something. She has a fairly high up position, so there's a lot of nepotism going on there, and it looks like moving his own family members into key positions in his administration. Yet, whether Akhmat or Adam Kadyrov, it says later, would actually take over in the event of their father's death is debatable. When Ramzan's father died, he was 28 and still had to wait several years to take office, as Russian law bars those under 30 from serving as Chechen leader. His experience is a far cry from that of his eldest son, who has only just reached adulthood and thus far only led a youth group. So it's unlikely that either of his children will be able to take over if Kadyrov was to die imminently. And of course, that means, well, either they change the rules somehow, but if they're that connected to Russia, that will be unlikely. So will there be some kind of regent? Will there be some other important person to effectively rule? Well, other high-ranking Chechen officials, it says later, have also started taking on tasks that previously would have fallen to the Chechen leader. In one recent example, Adam Delimkanov, a Russian lawmaker and one of Kadyrov's right-hand men, travelled to Iran to represent the Republic on an official visit. Kadyrov has built a trusted network within his inner circle, allowing him to keep some of his hold on Chechnya, even if his health declines, says Chambers, who is an expert in this matter. I haven't mentioned him earlier. It was I am sort of skipping through this article. Quote, these are long-time stakeholders with specific roles in managing specific parts of both the Republic's formal and informal politics, says Chambers. But it's also these men who could foreseeably take over Chechnya's top spot in the event of Ramzan's death. The Republic's leading families are already well versed in jostling behind the scenes to move up the ranks and gain advantageous positions, says Chambers. Without Kadyrov in the picture to keep them in line, that fighting is likely to become more apparent and potentially even bloody. The three most likely men to take over from Kadyrov are Apti Alaudanov. So Alaudanov is to do with the Chechen Akhmat, not the son Akhmat, but the special forces that actually have a lot of Russians in them. They're not just Chechen special forces, and they've been used a lot. And we've seen him be quite a prominent player in the war. Anyway, so the three most likely men are Alaudanov, who commands Chechen Akhmat unit fighting in Ukraine, Magomed Daudov, the Speaker of the Chechen Parliament, and the aforementioned Delimkanov, leading the Chechen branch of the National Guard of Russia, which is de facto independent from Moscow. And so it goes on to talk about these sort of three various people and what their advantages and disadvantages are. But we're just going to join it towards the end, which is ultimately anyone hoping to take Kadyrov's place, whether that means taking a more active role as the warlord's health declines or replacing him following his death, would need the Kremlin's blessing. Moscow has its own web of posturing officials, each with their own preferences. Quote, I'd consider Adam Delimkanov, for example, to be on the Kremlin's blacklist. Reasonably, he is the best qualified, but he also knows where all the skeletons are buried, says Moore, another expert. Too many in Moscow hate him, especially in the security services. So the things that are of concern, really, for what the Russians want are unwavering loyalty to the Kremlin and support for the invasion of Ukraine. So those two things, loyalty and support for the Russians in the war in Ukraine. With the memory of the two Chechen wars still recent, continues the Kyiv Independent, it is also vital that any successor to Kadyrov be able to maintain security and stability in the region. So that's really important for Russia. They don't want to be drawn away to help keep the peace in places like this during a transfer of power. They don't want anything like what's going on in Armenia or Azerbaijan, with neighbors. They don't want anything like what's going on in Georgia. They can't afford to divert attention. So anything that happens with Chechnya needs to be in a scenario where it is advantageous for Russia, obviously, but it works so they do not have to get involved. And the final thing that we're going to look at, another article here, this time from the New Republic. This I meant to share with you a couple of weeks back, but just haven't really had a chance to do an extra. This was around the time that Marjorie Taylor Greene was causing problems for the Speaker Mike Johnson in terms of threatening him with a motion to vacate his seat so that he didn't present the bill, the Ukraine aid bill, to the floor to get voted on. And this article came out saying, well, Russia's buying politicians in Europe. So we've seen all of these examples of Russian interference in European politics, of AfD and Dutch politicians and those in other places, in one of them in the Baltics, some in, I think, Czechia. The Czechia intelligence services have been doing their investigations, the Polish intelligence services. So the Russians are really heavily involved in European politics. But given that, the question asked here in this article is it happening here too, here being the US? A former CIA officer explains how a vast pro-Putin corruption network uncovered in Europe is a warning sign for the US. I'm not going to go into all the main part of the article that talks about how Europe has been compromised. We're going to go to the part where it talks about the US. And it starts here that it is naive to think that the same pattern does not exist in the United States, given the ample evidence of coordinated pro-Russian talking points from several Republican politicians. And of course, we had Mike Turner and a few other Republican politicians say very openly that it is really disturbing that pro-Putin, pro-Russian talking points are being, like, propaganda is being expressed on the Congress floor by fellow Republican politicians. And that was really, really, I think, a vital thing for Republicans to say of their own party. Just this week, the article continues, Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, this was some weeks back, spoke to Steve Bannon about Ukraine's persecution of Christians, which is a Kremlin talking point aimed at boosting the pro-Moscow wing of Ukraine's Orthodox Church. Of course, it is complete falsehood. The Russians are persecuting Christians, and that is part of their, systemically part of their war campaign. Anyway, it continues. The US should be spending money on the border with Mexico, not on Ukraine aid. That's a Kremlin talking point. Russia invaded Ukraine to defend itself against an expanding NATO. That's a Kremlin talking point. Call for a ceasefire and give Russia Crimea and eastern Ukraine. That's a Kremlin talking point. While we cannot say for sure if any Republican officials are on the Russian payroll in ways similar to their European counterparts, we can be sure that they've been approached. As the Director of National Intelligence wrote in 2021, Russian intelligence operatives and their proxies, quote, sought to use prominent US persons and media conduits to launder their narratives to US officials and audiences. These Russian proxies met with the provided materials to Trump administration linked US persons to advocate for formal investigations, hired a US firm to petition US officials, and attempted to make contact with several senior US officials. They also made contact with established US media figures, end quote. I mean, that is massive. Like, why that hasn't gained larger media coverage is incredible. I mean, for me, this should be front and center of discussions when you see people like Marjorie Taylor Greene spouting Russian talking points. Then we need to look at what the US intelligence wrote back in 2021, that these approaches have been made. As for payments, we've seen a disturbing pattern. In 2017, the article continues, Andrew Intrater donated $250,000 to Trump's inauguration fund and, a few months later, donated $35,000 to Trump's re-election campaign. Intrater is a cousin of Viktor Vekselberg, a Russian oligarch who was sanctioned by the US in 2018 for his connection to Putin. We know that oligarchs play an integral role in funding Russian influence operations. One oligarch revealed to Special Counsel Robert Mueller that Putin held quarterly meetings with his oligarchs to discuss strategic spending. In 2018, a Texas-based firm donated money to House Speaker Mike Johnson. The firm is 88% owned by 3 Russians. And last week, we learned that Trump Media received loans from a Russian bank to help the company, stay afloat before it went public and at a time when no US bank would lend money to Trump. This is what the Russians did with Marine Le Pen. When Marine Le Pen couldn't get money, the Russians stepped in and provided money for her French right-wing populist party so it could campaign. And lo and behold, that seems to be what has happened in the US. Anyway, the article continues. Any donations that might have been made through anonymous LLCs and PACs, perhaps with attached quid pro quos, are likely to remain opaque due to the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. And we cannot say if the financial transactions we do know about are nefarious, but the pattern paints a disturbing picture, particularly given many House Republicans' rabid opposition to Ukraine aid and Trump's reported Ukraine peace plan, which could cede Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine to Russia. A similar plan was floated by Paul Manafort, Trump's 26th campaign chairman, and his partner Konstantin Kilimnik, a Russian intelligence operative during the 2016 election. Now, Manafort was done, and then was he pardoned by Trump? I mean, Manafort is an incredibly dodgy character, and Trump has now asked him back on the campaign staff. Honestly, if you wonder about what Manafort was involved in, what happened in the lead up, particularly to the 2016 election, but then and beyond, check out the incredible documentary on Amazon Prime called Active Measures. Active Measures is one of the most densely packed with information documentaries I've ever seen. It's just incredible. Anyway, we continue. Among the entities promoted by the Voice of Europe propaganda network, so this was it's apparently going to be sanctioned now, but it's that proxy Russian media entity that the Czech and Polish intelligence services outed as being this propaganda arm. So among the entities promoted by the Voice of Europe propaganda network was Hungary's Centre for Fundamental Rights, which, quote, considers preserving national identity, sovereignty and Judeo-Christian social traditions as its primary mission. CFR is funded by the government of Viktor Orban and has twice organised a conference in Budapest for the Conservative Political Action Committee. So this is where we're going back to the stuff I was talking about with regard to Viktor Orban. Which helps shape policy on the American right. The Heritage Foundation, which has spearheaded Project 2025. So Project 2025 is Trump's blueprint for power when he gets in, which has been drawn up by the Heritage Foundation. And it's what will happen as soon as Trump is voted in. And it is essentially one of the most worrying documents I've ever seen in my life. Oh my goodness, is everything I am dead set against being laid out and organized such that essentially Trump would have authoritarian rule within a very short time period. And as it says here, Project 2025, the authoritarian blueprint for a future Republican administration, has been increasingly cozy with Hungary. So that's the Heritage Foundation, and even hosted Orban privately last month. It is quite possible, perhaps even likely, that some people who are in the Russian payroll were at the Heritage event, their role to influence and build support for pro-Russian policies. We now have overwhelming evidence of vast pro-Russian influence operations throughout Europe that seek to exploit politicians, media personalities and others, and some of these efforts have been successful. Here in the United States, while a pattern has emerged, we don't know the full extent of the influence yet, but it would be foolish, not to mention dangerous, to think we are immune. And indeed, this is probably a good time for me to bring in that article that I wrote some time back now concerning Viktor Orban and Tucker Carlson and whatnot. It helps if I actually don't put a typo in there. This is called It can be found on Only Sky Carlson. Heritage, Russia, follow the money. And this shows the connections between many of these entities with, I don't know how much, but some money going from Russia through Hungary to the Heritage Foundation. And then lo and behold, it was really interesting. And in this article, I lay out how Victoria Coates and others in the Heritage Foundation initially had a pro-Ukraine stance at the beginning of the war, like early 2022, when everyone's like, this is terrible, this is terrible. And then this needs to be explained, right? So how can you have, this is a terrible thing, Russia invading Ukraine is bad, and then suddenly do a 180 shift and have the opposite opinion? That actually, we're kind of all for appeasement and pro-Russia. And it all comes down to the influence. The best explanation of that data is that the influence they were getting from their funders and from people in their organisation who have connections to Hungary and therefore to Russia. And some of the stuff that the Heritage Foundation was saying after during, when Kiev was being attacked and whatnot, and Biden giving $700 to Hawaiian victims, but he took $900 from them and sent it to Ukraine. On the left is Kiev, on the right is Maui, and of course that was then called out as being massive disinformation. That's not what happened, and that's not how money works, and etc. etc. But the Heritage Foundation were presenting this massive Russian talking point disinformation, like overt Kremlin disinformation on their Twitter account. And Victoria Coates comes out and then it's done a 180 shift, and then, well, why are we giving blank checks to Ukraine? All of this in line with exactly what the Russians would like, to the point where it caused the Heritage Foundation's own director of their Centre for National Defence, Lieutenant General retired Thomas Spur, to submit his resignation. And it's worth reading that resignation as well, because he is like, I can't handle this. This isn't cool. So there is definitely compromise within the Heritage Foundation, but you can argue within many of these entities that are operating in that same ecosystem. I've said before, it's interesting that American Enterprise Institute, for example, that traditionally would have been fairly similar to Heritage Foundation, is entirely different to the Heritage Foundation, and that's because of the close connection it has to the Institute for the Study of War, where they have members of the ISW are also, board members or whatever of the American Enterprise Institute. So you have there one kind of sort of pro US capitalism, free market think tanks, economic think tanks, which is a bit like what the Heritage Foundation is, although that's taken on a more kind of cultural outlook with regard to conservative Christianity and so on and so forth. But they would otherwise have been aligned, but now are in very different places. But honestly, the two really good articles to read, well, I'm not going to call mine really good, but I think it is well worth a read for you, is Carlson, Heritage, Russia, Follow the Money, and then the New Republic article, How Viktor Orban Built His Illiberal State. I'll link both of those in the description below. Let me know what you think about the topics that have been discussed here. Thank you for listening. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.